You ever notice how water remembers exactly where it's supposed to go even when people try to lie to it? Because the night Rebecca Hale's basement started taking on water, like a sinking ship, I was standing 200 yards away on my field-bone dry boots planted in soil that should have been drowned weeks ago, and all I could smell was clean rain instead of that chemical runoff they dumped on me 3 weeks earlier. It didn't start with a storm. It started with a smell, sharp metallic, like wet concrete and fertilizer gone bad, creeping across my land before the sound even reached me, a low, steady hiss like something leaking that shouldn't be. I stepped out onto my porch just after midnight and saw it, a dark ribbon of water cutting through my lower acres, reflecting the moon in broken pieces. My name is Ethan Cole, and I've spent 15 years as a civil drainage engineer, which means I don't just see water, I read its slope, angle, velocity, soil absorption. Every inch tells a story, and this one was screaming wrong because my field doesn't flood, not like that, not from a gentle half-inch of rain. This was redirected, forced, pushed downhill from somewhere else. And I already knew exactly where that somewhere was. Willow Ridge Estates, neat rows of identical houses perched just uphill their HOA board run by Rebecca Hale, a woman who smiled like she was doing you a favor while quietly rewriting the rules underneath your feet. I grabbed my flashlight and walked the boundary line, boots sinking where they never should have, sunk the air thick with that sour processed runoff smell, the kind that clings to your throat and makes you taste it long after you leave. And then I saw it, fresh cut channel along the tree line, shallow but precise, carved just enough to guide the flow straight into my property, clean edges, no erosion yet, which meant it was recent engineered, not natural. And that's when I knew this wasn't whether this was design. I followed the trench uphill until I hit the fence line where my land met theirs, and there was new drainage pipe angled just right to dump everything onto me like I was their personal overflow basin. I didn't say a word that night. I just stood there listening to the water rush through something they thought I wouldn't understand, because people like Rebecca always assume land is just dirt and water is just inconvenience. They don't see the math behind it, the law behind it, the way 1 inch of slope can decide who pays and who drowns. By morning, my field looked like it had been through a storm 3 times bigger than what actually hit. Puddles stretched across 40 yards, crops flattened, soil saturated past recovery. And when I called the county, they gave me the same answer they always give when paperwork is involved: we'll look into it, Mr. Cole, which means nothing moves unless you prove everything. And Rebecca, she didn't even try to hide it. She drove down in that white SUV, stepped out in heels that sank half an inch into my soaked ground, and gave me that practice smile. Oh, Ethan, it's just runoff. These developments need updated drainage. You understand progress. Right the way she said progress like it excused everything, like gravity itself worked for her. I nodded because I did understand, just not the way she thought I understood how water behaves when you lie to it, how systems fail when they're built on shortcuts, and how time doesn't punish immediately. It waits, it builds pressure quietly, invisibly, until one day it doesn't ask permission anymore. And as I stood there watching that water creep across land that had never flooded in 40 years, I realized something she didn't know yet. I wasn't going to fight the water. I was going to let it remember. I did not file a complaint the next morning, and I did not call a lawyer. Instead, I walked the perimeter of my land with a measuring wheel in one hand and a notebook in the other, the sun barely over the tree line, the air still damp enough to carry that same chemical tang from the night before. And every step I took told me more than any official report ever would, because water does not lie. It leaves a trail, depth patterns, sediment lines, pressure march along the soil, and I could see exactly how they had done it. The trench they cut was shallow but precise, dropping just under 1% grade over 60 yards, enough to redirect flow without triggering most basic inspections. And that pipe of the fence line was angled at maybe 12 degrees off natural runoff, which meant every gallon they pushed would accelerate once it hit my lower slope, turning my field into a catch basin. I crouched down and pressed my fingers into the mud. It was saturated deeper than it should have been for such a small rain, which told me they had already tested this system before last night. This was not a one-time mistake. This was planned, repeated, refined. I stood up and looked toward Willow Ridge, the rooftops catching morning light like nothing was wrong, like everything was exactly as it should be. And for them, it probably was they had solved their drainage problem by exporting it downhill onto the one piece of land they assumed would not fight back a quiet 40-acre field owned by a guy who kept to himself. What they did not know was that I'd spent years designing systems that prevented exactly this kind of shortcut. I knew the regulations the ones most. Developers skim over the clauses about natural flow, preservation, the limits on artificial redirection, the requirement that any modification cannot increase downstream impact. And I knew something even more important. I knew how to prove it. But proving it takes time, and time is something people like Rebecca rarely respect because they think if nothing happens immediately, then nothing will happen at all. I spent the next 3 days documenting everything: elevation readings every 10 feet, flow direction during light rain, soil absorption rates. I even pulled old county maps from when my grandfather first bought this land back when the original drainage patterns were recorded in black ink on yellow paper. Those maps showed the truth, the way water had moved across this land for decades before anyone built those identical houses uphill. And when I overlaid their new system in my head, the problem became obvious. They had created a shortcut for water, but shortcuts always come with a cost. Somewhere else the afternoon, I finally walked up to their side. Again, Rebecca was already outside, talking to a contractor, her voice sharp but polished, the kind that carries authority without ever raising volume. She noticed me immediately. That smile, snapping into place like it was part of her uniform. Ethan, she said, as if we were discussing lawn care instead of what she had done. I kept my voice calm, because calm is harder to argue with. You rerouted your drainage. I said, simple, direct, no room to twist. Her expression did not change. We updated infrastructure to meet community needs. She replied, the words clean, rehearsed like she had practiced in a mirror. I nodded and looked past her at the pipe, the trench, the slope, all of it sitting there in plain sight. You pushed your runoff on my land, I said, and for a split second her smile tightened just enough to show she understood exactly what I meant. Then it came back stronger. You cannot stop natural water flow, she said almost casually, and that was the moment I knew she thought she had already won, because she was right about one thing: you cannot stop natural water flow. But what she did not realize was that what they built was not natural at all, and the difference between natural and engineered is where everything falls apart. I let the silence sit there between us just long enough for her to feel like she had the last word. Then I turned and walked back down my hill, boots crunching over drying mud, already calculating angles, distances, timing. Because I was not going to block their water, I was going to give it back exactly the way it was meant to move. And when it did, it would not ask me who was responsible. It would just follow the truth. I started before sunrise, because that is when the land tells the truth without interference. The air cool, the ground firming up just enough to hold a clean footprint, and every inch of my field still carried the memory of what they had forced onto it 3 days earlier. The surface looked like it was drying, but beneath that top layer, the soil was heavy, saturated past its natural capacity, which meant the next storm would not soak in, it would move. And I needed to know exactly how fast I walked the original drainage path, the one my grandfather used to point out when I was a kid, back when this was just pasture and fence lines and not a battleground of paperwork and shortcuts. He used to say, water always finds the honest path. And standing there now, I could see it, the faint depression that curved across the land, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. That was the original flow, the one recorded in county maps, the one the law still recognized. Whether people remembered it or not, I knelt down and brushed away a thin layer of silt with my hand, exposing the older soil beneath, firmer, more compacted, shaped over decades by consistent movement, not the chaotic pooling I was dealing with now. This was where the water wanted to go, not where it had been forced to go. And that difference, that subtle, quiet difference, was everything, because the law does not protect convenience. It protects precedent, and precedent in land is written by time, not by whatever someone builds last week. I spent the rest of that morning marking elevations, small wooden stakes every 20 feet, each one measured, and recorded slope percentages written in pencil across my notebook pages. The numbers lined up exactly how I expected they would. The natural grade dropped away from the houses in a gentle curve that bypassed my lower field entirely before emptying into a drainage easement half a mile east. But what Rebecca's contractor had done was cut across that curve, creating a direct path that shaved distance and increased velocity which solved their problem immediately and transferred all of it onto me. It was efficient, I would give them that. Efficient and completely out of compliance. I stood up and looked toward their development. Again, rows of clean siding and manicured lawns, hiding a system that only worked because it ignored the rules underneath it. And I could already see the failure point, not obvious, not dramatic, just a quiet inevitability built into the math. If the natural flow was restored, their redirected channel would no longer carry the volume they designed for, which meant pressure would build at the lowest resistance point. And in developments like that, the lowest resistance is never the street. It is the foundation, the places people do not see until it is too late. I did not need to damage anything. I did not need to block anything. All I had to do was remove the artificial shortcut and let the original path take over, and the system they built would collapse under its own assumptions. The rest of the day I spent gathering what I needed, not equipment, nothing dramatic, just documentation, copies of the county drainage maps, permit requirements sections highlighted, where it clearly stated that any alteration must not increase downstream burden and that original flow patterns must be preserved. I took photos of their trench, the pipe, the angle, everything timestamp stored, because when this played out, it would not be about arguing, it would be about showing, and showing works best when the facts are undeniable. That evening, the sky started to shift, clouds rolling in from the west, thick, slow moving, the kind that carry real rain, not the light drizzle. For before I stood on my porch watching the wind move across the tops of the trees and felt that familiar pressure in the air, the kind that comes right before a system resets itself. And I could almost hear my grandfather's voice. Again, steady calm, reminding me that land does not forget, it only waits. And as the first drops hit the ground, soft at first, then building into a steady rhythm, I realized something simple and final. I was not preparing for a fight. I was preparing for a correction. The rain did not arrive all at once. It built slowly, the kind that starts as a whisper against the roof, then settles into a steady weight that you feel more than hear. I stood at my kitchen window watching the first streams form along the upper ridge of my field, thin lines at first tracing paths. I had already memorized every dip, every rise, every place the soil would give or resist. And for a while it looked just like before, water sliding off their land, gathering speed as it reached the trench they cut, and then spilling over into my property. Except this time, I was ready, not with barriers, not with anything they could point at and call obstruction, but with something far quieter. I had spent the afternoon restoring what they erased. Small adjustments, barely visible, unless you knew exactly where to look. Shallow cuts along the original contour, clearing debris from the natural channel, opening a path that had been there long before any of their foundations were poured. It was not construction, it was correction, and as the rain picked up, I could see the difference. Immediately the water hit the trench like before, but instead of continuing straight into my lower acres, it hesitated just for a moment, enough for gravity to make a decision, and gravity always chooses the easiest truth. The flow split part of it, still pushing forward along their artificial line, but more of it slipping sideways into the restored channel, the one that curved away from my field and disappeared toward the east, just like it had for decades. I stepped outside, the air thick with the smell of wet earth, clean this time, not that sour chemical mix from before, and listened to the change. The sound was different, less aggressive, less force, more like a steady movement instead of a rush. And that told me everything I needed to know. The system was rebalancing, not because I stopped it, but because I removed the lie they built into it. Across the fence line I could see lights flicking on in the houses, uphill silhouettes moving behind windows as the rain intensified, gutters overflowing in places they had not expected because their design assumed all that volume would be gone by now, pushed onto me instead of staying with them. I walked the length of my boundary one more time, flashlight cutting through the rain, checking each marker, each point where the flow could shift, and every reading matched what I had calculated. The restored path was taking over, pulling more water away from my land with each passing minute, redistributing it across the terrain the way it was meant to move, which meant something else had to give, because water does not disappear, it relocates. And when you build a system that only works by ignoring that fact, the correction does not happen gently, it happens where you're least prepared for it. I stopped at the far edge of my property, where the natural channel narrowed, and watched the water gather speed as it exited my land, heading straight Toward the lower end of Willow Ridge, the part they built last, the part with the shallowest grading and the highest density of homes, and for a second I just stood there letting the rain soak through my jacket, feeling that quiet certainty settle in my chest. Not satisfaction, not yet, just recognition that everything was moving exactly as it should have from the beginning. Behind me, my field held firm, no standing water, no pooling, just steady runoff moving through like it belonged there, which it did. And as I turned back toward the house, I caught a glimpse of Rebecca's place up on the hill, her porch light on her figure, just visible through the rain, standing there watching the same storm from a different angle. And I wondered if she could hear it yet, that subtle shift in sound when a system starts to fail, not with a crash, but with a change in direction, because by the time people notice the water where it should not be, it is already too late to ask where it came from. By the time the rain settled into a steady downpour, the system they built had already started showing stress, not in obvious ways, not yet, but in the small details that only matter when everything else depends on them. Gutters along the lower row of houses began to overflow, first thin streams slipping over the edges where downspouts could not keep up the sound, sharper, now more chaotic than the controlled flow I'd been hearing on my side. I stood at the edge of my field, watching the water move clean across my land, following that restored curve like it had never been interrupted, and for the first time in days, there was no standing water at my boots, just movement, steady, continuous, exactly how it was meant to be across the fence line. Though it was a different story. I could see pooling forming near the foundations of the lowest houses, subtle at first, shallow sheets reflecting porch lights and street lamps, but growing with every minute as more water arrived than their system could carry away, because the path they designed no longer had somewhere else to send it. I walked along my boundary, keeping my distance, letting the rain blur the edges of everything except the motion itself. And I could hear voices now, carried between gusts of wind, doors opening, people stepping out, trying to understand why water was gathering where it never had before. One man stood at the corner of his driveway, staring down at a drain that was clearly backing up, leaves and debris spinning in place as the flow reversed direction, just slightly enough to signal failure, not dramatic, just inevitable. I checked my watch, then looked back toward the channel where the natural path exited my land. The volume had increased exactly as expected, pulling more runoff away from me and redistributing it across the terrain, which meant pressure was building somewhere else, and pressure always finds the weakest point in developments like this. The weakest point is not the pavement, not the street. It is the areas no one sees until something goes wrong, the low corners, the unfinished edges, the parts built fast because no one thinks they will matter. I saw Rebecca again, this time moving quickly across her yard, holding something in her hand, probably a phone, her posture tighter, now less composed, as she spoke to someone I could not hear, but I did not need to hear it. I knew the conversation because I have had it before on job sites when systems do not behave the way they were promised. The question is always the same: why is this happening? And the answer is always buried in decisions no one wanted to question earlier. The rain kept coming, not violent, just persistent, the kind that tests everything evenly without giving you an excuse to blame extremes. And the pooling grew deeper, now reaching the edges of concrete steps, pressing against garage thresholds, finding every slight dip in grading that had been ignored when everything was still dry. I turned away for a moment and looked back across my field, the soil firm underfoot, the water passing through like it belonged there. No damage, no saturation, just flow. And it struck me how quiet it fell on my side compared to the tension building uphill, like standing on opposite sides of the same equation. One balanced the other, tipping slowly towards something unavoidable. I started walking back toward the house, boots steady against the ground, each step reinforcing what I already knew. This was not an accident. This was not sudden. This was the result of design meeting reality, and reality does not negotiate. As I reached my porch, I paused and glanced back one more time. The lights in Willow Ridge brighter now, more movement, more voices, and though I could not see inside those houses, I could imagine exactly what they were starting to notice. First the dampness, then the seepage, then the realization that the water was not leaving the way it was supposed to. And as I stepped inside, closing the door behind me with the sound of rain still steady against the roof, I understood something simple and final. The correction had already begun, and there was no way to reverse it. without admitting where it started the rain. Kept falling through the night, steady, relentless, not loud enough to feel dramatic, but heavy enough to expose every weakness they built into that system. I woke up just before dawn to a different kind of silence, the kind that comes when something shifts from manageable to undeniable. And when I stepped outside, the air felt thicker, cooler, carrying that damp weight that tells you water has nowhere left to go. My field stretched out in front of me, exactly the way it should have been weeks ago, firm ground with shallow channels guiding runoff cleanly across the land. Not a single patch of standing water, just movement controlled and quiet, like a system doing its job without needing attention. I took a few steps forward, boots pressing into soil that held its structure, and listened. And for the first time since this started, the dominant sound was not coming from my side. It was coming from uphill, distant at first, then clearer as the wind shifted. Voices, engines, doors slamming, that low, hollow echo of water where it should not be. I walked up along the boundary again, not in a hurry, just steady, because I already knew what I was going to see before I even reached the fence line. And when I did, it was all there, laid out exactly like the math said. It would be the lower section of Willow Ridge, was saturated, not flooded in some dramatic sweeping way, but overwhelmed water pooling along the edges of driveways, pressing up against foundation walls, creeping into places that were never meant to handle. Sustained flow, the drainage grates that should have carried it away were struggling, pulling in what they could, but losing ground as more volume arrived from higher up the development, because their system still assumed it could send everything downhill onto me. Except now, there was no shortcut, no relief point, no place for that excess to go except back into itself. I saw two men standing near a storm drain, one of them pushing debris away with a shovel, the other looking down into the grate like he was waiting for it to fix itself. But the water level was not dropping, it was holding steady, which is worse because it means the system has reached capacity, and any additional flow will have nowhere to go. I kept walking along the fence line, my eyes tracking the movement, the way the water spread across concrete surfaces, following the smallest imperfections, the slight dips where slabs had settled over time, the seams between sections of pavement, all the places that do not matter until they matter all at once. And then I saw Rebecca again. This time, she was not standing still. She was moving from house to house, her posture tight, her steps quick, her voice carrying just enough for me to catch fragments. Call someone, get them out here. This is not supposed to happen. And there was the moment people realized that what they were told and what is real are not the same thing. I stayed where I was, not hidden, just not involved, because this was not something I needed to explain. The evidence was already in motion. Every inch of water on their side told the story better than I ever could. I glanced back over my shoulder, my field, one more time, steady, dry, functioning exactly as it had for decades before. Someone decided to outsmart the system, and for a brief second, I felt that shift again. Not satisfaction, not yet, just confirmation that everything I had seen, everything I had calculated was playing out in real time, without me needing to force anything. The sky began to lighten, a dull gray breaking through the clouds as the rain finally started to ease. But by then the damage to their design was already done, not something you could wipe away, not something you could redirect in the moment, because systems like that do not fail instantly. They fail in layers. And once that process starts, it does not stop just because the rain does. And as I turn away, heading back toward my house, I knew the next part would not be about water at all. It would be about accountability. And that is something people like Rebecca are never prepared to face when the ground underneath them stops agreeing with the story they built on top of it. By mid-morning, the rain had stopped completely, but the problem had not the sky clearing into that pale, washed-out blue that always comes after a long storm, while everything on their side still carried the weight of what had already been set in motion. I walked back up the boundary line with my notebook in hand, not because I needed more data, but because I knew what was coming next, and documentation is what turns a situation into a case. The ground on my side had already begun to settle, excess moisture draining cleanly through the restored path, leaving behind firm soil that held its shape the way it always had, and that contrast made everything uphill stand out even more clearly. The lower section of Willow Ridge was still holding water, not standing deep enough to draw panic from a distance, but enough to create that slow, creeping realization for anyone paying attention that this was not draining the way it should. I could hear some pumps, now a low mechanical hum, echoing faintly from multiple houses kicking on in uneven intervals, trying to keep up with something they were never designed to handle, because those systems rely on temporary surges, not sustained pressure, and what they were facing was not a surge, it was a redistribution, the kind that keeps feeding itself as long as the conditions remain unchanged. I stopped near the fence line where the trench they cut was still visible, now partially eroded from the night, before its clean edges softened by real flow, exposing how fragile that shortcut really was, because engineered paths that ignore natural patterns do not hold their shape once the system pushes back. I took a few photos, time-stamped, clear angles, showing where their modification intersected with my property, because at this point, it was no longer about whether they caused it. It was about showing how directly and how recently across the street I saw a contractor's truck pulling, tires crunching against wet pavement, two men stepping out with that cautious pace people use when they already suspect the problem is bigger than what they were told. Rebecca was there again, speaking quickly, pointing toward the lower end of the development, then back toward my field, her gesture sharper, now less controlled, like she was trying to redirect the narrative the same way they had tried to redirect the water. One of the men walked over toward the drainage line, crouching down near the pipe opening where it crossed into my land. He ran his hand along the edge, then looked uphill, tracing the path visually, and I could see the moment it clicked for him, the slight pause, the shift in posture. When understanding replaces assumption, he stood up and said something I could not hear, but Rebecca's response came faster, louder enough for the tone to carry, even if the words did not. Defensive, tight, already searching for distance from the decision that created this. I stayed where I was, not stepping closer, not interrupting, because the truth does not need help once it starts revealing itself. I just watched as more residents came outside, standing at the edges of their driveways, looking down at water that should have been gone by now, asking quiet questions to each other, pointing at drains, at corners, at anything that might explain what they were seeing. But the explanation was not in those details. It was in the system they had trusted to take care of them, without question, and systems do not fail randomly. They fail exactly where they were designed to ignore reality. I flipped open my notebook and reviewed the notes I had already written, slope measurements, permit references, the original drainage maps, all of it aligning with what was happening in front of me. Because this was never about guessing, it was about letting the process reach its natural conclusion without interference. And now that it had, the next step was inevitable, not confrontation, not arguments, just accountability, documented, clear, and grounded in facts that could not be dismissed as opinion. I closed the notebook and looked one more time across the line that divided my land from theirs, a simple boundary that had never been an issue until someone decided it was convenient to treat it like a solution. And as the morning settled into a calm that did not match the tension still hanging over their side, I understood that what happened next would not depend on me saying anything at all. Because once a system exposes its own flaw, the only question left is who is willing to admit it. By early afternoon, the movement had shifted from confusion to response, trucks lining the street in uneven rows, doors opening and closing with that hollow metallic sound that carries farther than it should in damp air. I watched from the boundary line as more people gathered near the lower end of the development, their attention fixed on the same areas, the same corners, where water still lingered, refusing to disappear the way it was supposed to. A county vehicle pulled in next, white with that faded emblem on the side, the kind you only notice when something has gone wrong, and a man stepped out holding a clipboard, scanning the ground before he even looked at the houses, because the ground tells the story first. Every time I stayed where I was, not approaching, not avoiding, just present, because there's a difference between inserting yourself into a situation and letting it unfold on its own terms. The inspector walked the length of the street, slowly crouching at different points, checking drain openings, running his hand along the edges where water had collected. Then he looked uphill, tracing the path visually the same way I had done days ago, except now the evidence was not theoretical. It was active, visible, undeniable. I saw him pause near one of the storm grates where debris had gathered and water still circled in a shallow spiral, not draining, not rising, just holding steady. And that pause told me everything, he was already asking the right questions, because when water does not behave as expected, the issue is never at the surface. It is always upstream. Rebecca moved toward him quickly, her posture controlled again, but tighter than before, her voice measured as she began explaining. Something pointing toward the drains, the street, the visible problems, but I could see the moment his focus shifted away from her gestures and back to the slope of the land, because explanations do not override physics, and physics does not adjust itself to match a narrative. He nodded once, then walked past her, following the natural grade toward the fence line, toward the place where their system crossed into mine. I did not move. I just stood there as he approached the boundary, looking down at the trench, the pipe, the angle of the cut, his eyes taking in the details without needing anyone to describe them. He crouched, examined the edge where fresh soil still contrasted against older, compacted ground, then stood up and looked back uphill again, the same path, the same line of reasoning. And when he finally spoke, his tone was neutral, but firm enough to carry just a little beyond where they stood. This does not match the original drainage pattern. Simple words, but heavy, because they did not accuse, they established. And once something is established, everything that follows builds on it. Rebecca responded immediately, her voice a fraction sharper, insisting that the modifications were necessary, that they were approved, that everything had been handled properly. But approval does not mean compliance, and necessity does not rewrite regulations. The inspector asked a few more questions, short, direct, each one narrowing the focus until the conversation stopped being about symptoms and started being about cause. And I could see it in the way the contractor shifted his weight, the way he avoided looking directly at the trench again, that quiet recognition that what had been built could not be defended the way they intended. I took out my phone and captured a few more photos, not for leverage, not for argument, just for record, because at this point the process was already moving forward without me needing to push it. The residents nearby had gone quieter, now listening, watching, realizing that the issue was not random, that it had a direction, a source, and that source was being traced in real time. The inspector made a few notes, then stood still for a moment, looking between my land and theirs as if measuring more than just distance. And when he finally turned back toward the street, his expression had settled into that calm, professional focus that comes right before decisions are put into writing. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and looked out across my field one more time, steady, dry, unchanged by everything happening just beyond it. And in that moment, the difference between our two sides felt clearer than it ever had, not just in the way the land held water, but in the way it held truth, because one side was built to follow it, and the other had tried to redirect it. And as the county vehicle door closed with a solid echo that cut through the quiet afternoon air, I knew the next step would not be about what anyone said. It would be about what was documented. And once something like that is written down, it does not get undone by explanations. The report arrived 2 days later, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with the quiet weight of official language printed on county letterhead, the kind that does not need emotion because it carries authority in every line. I stood on my porch when the envelope came, the paper stiff between my fingers as I opened it and read through the findings. Slowly, not because I needed to understand them, but because I wanted to see how closely they matched what I had already known. Unauthorized alteration of natural drainage patterns, increased downstream impact, non-compliant grading adjustments, and there was written clean and permanent exactly what the land had already shown anyone willing to look across the fence line. The activity had changed. No more frantic movement, no more quick fixes. Instead, there was a different kind of energy measured. Contained contractors returning not to defend what had been built, but to undo it. Machinery positioned along the same path they had carved weeks earlier, only now the goal was not to redirect water, but to remove the shortcut entirely. I walked the boundary again that afternoon, watching as sections of the trench were filled and the pipe disconnected and pulled back, the ground reshaped to match the original contour, not perfectly, not yet, but close enough to restore the function that had always been there. The sound of equipment was steady, controlled, nothing like the rush of water from before. And as each piece of their modification disappeared, the system began to settle back into balance, even without rain. The difference was visible, the way the land held its shape, the way small residual moisture followed the restored path, instead of collecting where it never belonged. I saw Rebecca standing near the work site, arms crossed, her posture rigid, her attention fixed on the changes, as if watching something unravel that she could not stop. She did not look at me, and I did not call out, because there was nothing left to argue. The outcome had already been decided. Not by me, not by her, but by the combination of law and physics that neither of us could rewrite. The residents moved differently now. Quieter, more aware conversations happening in lower tones as people adjusted to the realization that what had been presented as improvement had carried consequences. They were the ones dealing with the aftermath inside their homes, the dampness, the repairs, the questions about how something like this could have been approved in the first place. And I could see it in the way they watched the work